The Egyptian mummification trials. In 1250 BCE, within a sealed chamber along the western bank of the Nile near Thebes, a team of temple embalmers documented a procedure that was never meant for public ritual. Papyrus fragments discovered centuries later described repeated alterations to the extraction of internal organs, the drying interval in natron, and the sealing compounds used along cranial cavities. This was not a single burial, it was a controlled sequence. Bodies prepared under different conditions were stored in adjacent chambers and re-examined months later. Tissue shrinkage, skin integrity, odor retention, and discoloration were noted with unsettling precision. The objective was not spiritual reverence, it was optimization. Something was being tested. Ancient Egyptian mummification is often described as a sacred art perfected over millennia, but archaeological evidence suggests that perfection did not come gently. Early mummies show dramatic variation. Some retain facial structure, others collapse inward. In certain tombs, internal organs were removed through incisions as small as 2 inches, while in later dynasties the brain was extracted through the nasal passage using hooked bronze tools. Chemical analysis of preserved tissue reveals shifting ratios of natron salts, resins, and plant oils across generations. In several burial sites, clusters of partially preserved bodies were found stored away from elite tombs, lacking names or decoration. They appear to have been failures. One 20th century examination of remains from the Valley of the Kings identified differences in dehydration rates that correlate with seasonal temperature changes. This suggests embalmers were tracking environmental impact on decay. Some skulls display experimental perforations at different angles, as though testing the most efficient route for cranial removal without damaging facial structure. Linen wrapping patterns evolved as well. Earlier periods used loose bindings. Later dynasties applied tight cross-layered compression, reducing air pockets that accelerate decomposition. This progression reads less like ritual development and more like laboratory refinement. Temple records refer to houses of purification, where apprentices trained for years before participating in royal burials. Access was restricted, knowledge was inherited, not published. Tools were buried with their masters. No public inscriptions explain the failures that must have preceded the success of the intact mummies displayed in modern museums. Yet those intact bodies are statistical outliers. The consistency achieved in later periods implies systematic iteration. Someone compared results. Someone adjusted variables. Someone recorded what worked and what did not. When European explorers first began unwrapping mummies in the 1800s, many early excavation reports described unusual cavities filled with experimental resin mixtures. Some samples hardened differently, suggesting varied curing times. Others revealed signs of premature sealing, trapping moisture inside. Those flawed specimens rarely appear in museum exhibitions. They are cataloged quietly in storage. If mummification was only religious devotion, such variation would not exist at scale. The evidence instead suggests that ancient embalmers pursued biological preservation through repeated trial. They learned how flesh decays in desert heat. They manipulated chemical desiccation. They refined structural reinforcement. The process resembles the early foundations of anatomical science. And if these chambers truly functioned as experimental spaces, then the birth of preservation science began not in modern laboratories, but in stone rooms lit by oil lamps beside the Nile. How much did they learn about the human body while perfecting its stillness? And what else was tested in silence, beyond the reach of history? The Qin Mercury Experiment. In 210 BCE, as the first emperor of a unified China traveled across the eastern provinces, imperial physicians administered a final dose of what court records described as a longevity elixir. Within weeks, the emperor was dead. Official chronicles attributed his decline to sudden illness during the journey. Unofficial texts tell a different story. They speak of tremors, paranoia, insomnia, and a metallic taste that never left his mouth. The substance consumed was no accident. It was part of a sustained program designed to defeat mortality itself. During the reign of the first emperor, alchemists were summoned from across the empire and tasked with one objective: formulate an elixir capable of granting eternal life. Surviving manuscripts from the period reference compounds made from cinnabar, real gar, powdered jade, and liquid mercury. The proportions shifted over time. Early formulas relied heavily on mineral extracts dissolved in wine. Later attempts increased the mercury content, sometimes mixing it with sulfur to stabilize its form. Symptoms were recorded carefully: palpitations, dizziness, temporary bursts of energy followed by collapse. These were not isolated poisonings, they were iterative adjustments. Archaeological excavations near the mausoleum complex in Shanxi province uncovered bronze vessels containing residues of mercury-based mixtures. Soil samples in the burial mound reveal mercury concentrations far above natural levels, suggesting large-scale handling and refinement. Ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing within the tomb chamber, symbolizing celestial waters. Yet, this symbolic use masks something more practical. Mercury was not only revered for its shimmering liquid metal appearance, it was believed to transform the body from within, preserving vitality. That belief did not arise in a vacuum, it emerged from observation. Court physicians tracked the emperor's physical responses to each preparation. Records in the Records of the Grand Historian mention changes in temperament and behavior following consumption. Some scholars argue these were moral commentaries. Others suggest they reflect clinical observation. When lesser nobles were administered experimental doses, their outcomes were noted as well. Recovery times, onset of symptoms, duration of lucidity. The imperial court functioned as a closed system. Failures did not reach the public, but internally, data accumulated. Modern toxicology confirms that mercury exposure produces neurological effects consistent with the descriptions in Han-era texts: muscle weakness, cognitive disturbance, emotional instability, the very symptoms recorded by scribes over 2,000 years ago. What makes this disturbing is not that ancient alchemists misunderstood mercury, it is that they appeared to measure its impact systematically. Adjustments in dosage imply comparison. Comparison implies repetition. After the emperor's death, the narrative shifted. Blame was directed at rogue alchemists. Several were reportedly executed. Surviving formulas were sealed or destroyed. Subsequent dynasties continued immortality research but avoided public emphasis on mercury's dangers. The mausoleum itself remains partially unexcavated to this day, with official statements citing preservation concerns. High mercury vapor readings inside the tomb chamber have been confirmed by modern surveys, yet entry is restricted. If this was merely superstition, there would be no need for controlled variation in composition, no reason to track symptom progression across subjects. What emerges instead is the outline of a protochemical trial conducted within the highest levels of political power. The pursuit of immortality required experimentation. Experimentation required subjects. And subjects in this case were emperors and courtiers alike. The emperor sought eternity and instead accelerated decay. But in the process, did his physicians gain an early understanding of toxic thresholds and neurological disruption? And how many silent deaths formed the foundation of that knowledge? The Greek dissection records. In 430 BCE, as plague swept through Athens during the Peloponnesian War, physicians confronted a crisis unlike anything recorded before. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Symptoms varied. Some victims burned with fever, others bled internally. Many died within days. In the chaos, a small circle of medical practitioners began documenting patterns. They measured pulse strength. They noted skin discoloration. They observed how the eyes clouded just before death. What emerged from this catastrophe was not only survival attempts, but systematic anatomical observation. It was the beginning of controlled medical recording under lethal conditions. The Hippocratic corpus, attributed to the physician Hippocrates and his followers, contains some of the earliest surviving medical case studies. While public dissections were culturally restricted in classical Greece, battlefield casualties and plague victims provided unfiltered access to the human interior. Writings describe the appearance of inflamed organs, accumulation of fluid in the chest cavity, and swelling of the spleen. In some passages, physicians differentiate between superficial wounds and those that penetrated the muscle layers, suggesting direct inspection of internal structure. This was not speculative philosophy, it was tactile investigation. Archaeological evidence from burial grounds in the Athenian Kerameikos cemetery reveals skeletal remains bearing clean-cut marks on ribs and cranial bones. These incisions differ from combat injuries. They are precise, localized, and consistent across multiple bodies. Some scholars interpret them as post-mortem examinations. Others suggest surgical intervention attempts. Either interpretation points to intentional access to internal anatomy beyond ritual preparation. The language used in early Greek medical texts is clinical rather than mystical. Organs are described in terms of texture, position, and reaction to injury. The heart is noted for its pulsation, the liver for its density. The brain is referenced as a central organ influencing sensation, contradicting earlier beliefs that emotions resided solely in the heart. Such conclusions would not arise from external observation alone. They required exposure. Later accounts from Alexandria during the Hellenistic period record even more explicit anatomical exploration. Herophilus and Erasistratus are said to have conducted systematic dissections, possibly even vivisections on condemned prisoners. While debated, these reports reinforce a pattern: medical knowledge expanded through direct examination of the human body under controlled observation. What distinguishes these early Greek efforts is repetition. Physicians compared symptoms across cases. They classified diseases based on progression rather than divine attribution. They correlated wound depth with survival time. This analytical framework transformed death into data. Each fatality became a point of reference. Official narratives frame these developments as philosophical advancement, yet no inscriptions publicly detail the procedural steps taken to obtain anatomical clarity. No monuments celebrate the bodies opened in the name of understanding. Knowledge advanced quietly, shielded by academic circles and restricted access to texts. If early Greek physicians truly dissected human remains to refine their theories, then the foundations of Western medicine were laid not in abstract debate, but in silent rooms where the body was opened and examined without ceremony. Observation replaced superstition, but observation required intrusion. When did healing cross into experimentation? And how many unnamed bodies were measured, compared, and classified before medicine earned its reputation as a science? The Mithridatic Antidote trials. In 120 BCE, within the fortified palace of Pontus overlooking the Black Sea, King Mithridates VI initiated a program unlike any recorded in antiquity. Surrounded by physicians, herbalists, and alchemists, he ordered the preparation of controlled doses of poison, each carefully measured and administered under supervision. His fear was not irrational. Assassination by poison was a common weapon among rival courts, but Mithridates sought more than protection. He sought immunity. To achieve it, he turned his own body into a living laboratory. Ancient sources, including accounts from Pliny the Elder and Appian, describe how the king consumed minute quantities of toxins daily, gradually increasing the dosage over time. The substances included arsenic, hemlock, aconite, and extracts from venomous plants. Each ingestion was observed. Reactions were noted. Symptoms such as tremors, nausea, and hallucinations were recorded and compared. Adjustments followed. This was not reckless self-harm. It was iterative experimentation. Mithridates expanded his trials beyond himself. Court records and later Roman reports suggest that condemned prisoners and slaves were subjected to toxic compounds to determine lethal thresholds and antidotal efficacy. Those who survived provided data. Those who did not were silent variables. Through repetition, patterns emerged. Certain herbs mitigated specific poisons. Others intensified toxicity. Over time, the king's physicians compiled a complex compound believed to neutralize a wide spectrum of toxins. This formulation became known as Mithridatium. The composition of Mithridatium reportedly contained over 50 ingredients, including opium, myrrh, saffron, ginger, cinnamon, and ground viper flesh. Each component was selected for its perceived protective properties. The mixture was refined repeatedly, adjusted according to observed outcomes. Roman historians later recorded that the formula was seized and preserved after Mithridates' defeat, becoming a closely guarded state antidote. Emperors and military leaders relied on it for centuries, transforming a king's obsession into institutional pharmacology. Archaeological and historical evidence supports the persistence of this antidote tradition. Variations of Mithridatium were documented well into the medieval period, eventually evolving into the famed theriac of Andromachus, a compound prepared under strict supervision in Rome and Venice. The continuity of the formula across centuries suggests that its origins were grounded not in superstition, but in systematic observation and refinement. The most enduring legend surrounding Mithridates emerged at the end of his life. In 63 BCE, facing defeat by Roman forces, he attempted to end his life with poison. According to historical accounts, the attempt failed. His body, conditioned through years of exposure, resisted the toxins he had once feared. Unable to die by poison, he reportedly ordered a soldier to end his life by the sword. Whether embellished or not, the story reflects a reputation built on sustained chemical experimentation. Modern toxicology recognizes the phenomenon of acquired tolerance, known as Mithridatism, in which gradual exposure to certain toxins induces physiological resistance. While not universally effective for all poisons, the principle demonstrates that Mithridates' experiments were grounded in observable biological response. He lacked the language of pharmacokinetics or immunology, yet he understood the relationship between dose and effect. Observation guided adjustment. Adjustment guided survival. After his death, the knowledge he cultivated did not vanish. Roman authorities confiscated his medical archives, and his antidotal formulations were integrated into imperial pharmacology. The experiments that began in secrecy within a royal court influenced medicinal practices for nearly 2 millennia. Yet the methods by which this knowledge was obtained remain largely unrecorded. No official chronicle details the number of subjects exposed or the failures that preceded refinement. If Mithridates transformed poison into protection through controlled exposure, then his court represents one of the earliest chemical laboratories in recorded history. Fear of assassination became the catalyst for experimentation. The body became the test vessel. Survival became the data point. How many lives were sacrificed to define the boundary between toxin and antidote? And when immunity is achieved through calculated exposure to death itself, does the achievement represent scientific progress or the ultimate consequence of obsession? The Roman gladiator studies. In 80 CE, when the Colosseum opened in Rome, it was presented as a monument to imperial power and public entertainment. Tens of thousands gathered to witness staged combat between trained fighters, exotic animals, and condemned prisoners. But beneath the spectacle, another pattern unfolded. Gladiatorial combat was not random chaos. It was structured confrontation. Fighters were categorized by armor type, weapon length, and defensive equipment. Matchups were carefully selected. Wounds were observed. Outcomes were repeated. Over decades, the arena became a controlled environment, where the limits of the human body were tested in full view of the state. Roman medical practitioners known as Medici Gladiatorum were assigned specifically to treat injured fighters. Their role extended beyond emergency care. They studied trauma. Surviving writings from the Roman physician Galen, who served in a gladiator school in Pergamum, describe detailed knowledge of muscle groups, tendon attachments, and vascular response to injury. Galen wrote about differentiating arterial from venous bleeding based on color and flow rate. He described nerve damage and paralysis resulting from spinal trauma. These insights did not arise from theory alone. They came from repeated exposure to penetrating wounds. Excavations of gladiator cemeteries in Ephesus and York reveal skeletons with healed fractures, clean-cut injuries, and surgical intervention marks. Some skulls show circular depressions consistent with blunt force trauma followed by recovery. Others display precise amputations with evidence of bone remodeling, indicating survival after surgical removal. The consistency of these injuries suggests that gladiators were not simply disposable victims. They were valuable assets. Keeping them alive meant accumulating experience. Gladiator schools functioned like training academies. Diets were standardized. Barley-based meals and calcium-rich ash drinks were administered to enhance bone density. Instructors monitored endurance and recovery time. The state had economic incentive to preserve fighters long enough to maximize spectacle. But preservation required knowledge. Knowledge required observation. Combat pairings were not arbitrary. Certain armor combinations produced predictable wound patterns. A lightly armored retiarius faced a heavily shielded secutor. The net and trident tested agility against brute defense. Over time, Roman officials could anticipate which strikes were fatal and which were survivable. This predictability implies record-keeping. Although no central archive survives, the sophistication of Roman military medicine suggests that arena experience informed battlefield treatment. Publicly, the Colosseum symbolized dominance. Privately, it may have served as an anatomical theater. Unlike secret dissections in Greece, Roman trauma unfolded in daylight. Each laceration revealed structural truth about muscle depth, organ placement, and hemorrhage speed. Physicians refined suturing techniques. They developed cauterization methods to stop bleeding. They identified which abdominal wounds guaranteed death and which allowed intervention. When the gladiatorial system declined in the 4th century, so too did this concentrated source of trauma data. Later, medical texts reference knowledge gained from the arena but rarely describe its origin. The spectacle was condemned as barbaric. The lessons extracted from it remained embedded within evolving medical practice. If Roman physicians built surgical understanding on the bodies of gladiators, then the arena was more than entertainment. It was a sustained exposure to controlled injury on a scale unmatched in antiquity. The crowd saw blood, the state saw discipline, the physician saw anatomy in motion. How much of early surgical advancement depended on watching men fight for survival? And when knowledge is harvested from orchestrated violence, does progress carry the imprint of the arena long after the crowd has dispersed? The Mayan blood rituals. In 600 CE, within the limestone temples of the Yucatan Peninsula, Mayan rulers conducted ceremonies that left physical traces still visible in carved stone reliefs. These scenes depict kings and queens piercing their tongues or genitals with stingray spines, drawing blood onto folded bark paper that was later burned to release thick plumes of smoke. To outside observers, this appears purely symbolic, but glyphic inscriptions accompanying these images suggest something more deliberate. The ritual was not only sacrifice, it was induction. Mayan hieroglyphs frequently reference a state described as vision serpent emergence, in which participants reportedly entered altered states of consciousness after controlled blood loss. These episodes were recorded on stelae with specific dates, often linked to astronomical alignments. The regularity of these events implies planning. The repetition implies expectation. The body was subjected to stress. The mind was monitored for response. Archaeological finds at sites such as Yaxchilan and Palenque reveal ceremonial kits containing obsidian blades, stingray spines, and cordage designed for drawing blood in measured quantities. The placement of these tools within temple chambers suggests controlled environments rather than spontaneous ritual. Some inscriptions detail the duration between puncture and vision, indicating awareness of physiological timing. Bloodletting was conducted at intervals tied to lunar cycles or planetary movements, creating a layered system of biological and astronomical synchronization. Modern medical understanding confirms that acute blood loss, even in moderate amounts, can produce dizziness, lightheadedness, and altered perception. Combined with fasting, incense inhalation, and sensory isolation within temple chambers, the physiological impact would intensify. The Mayan elite appear to have recognized this cascade of effects. Rather than avoiding it, they orchestrated it. Skeletal remains of high-status individuals sometimes display repetitive microtrauma consistent with ritual perforation sites. Healed lesions on lower jaw bones and pelvic areas suggest long-term engagement in these practices. This was not a singular act of devotion. It was cyclical exposure to controlled stress. The consistency across generations indicates institutionalized repetition. Spanish colonial accounts, though biased, describe indigenous ceremonies involving self-inflicted bleeding to communicate with deities. However, pre-colonial glyphs show that these events were documented by Mayan scribes themselves. Dates, participants, and outcomes were carved into monuments. The precision of these records suggests that the experience of altered consciousness was anticipated and valued as evidence of divine contact. What remains unclear is how much of this process was experiential research. The Mayans tracked celestial movements with remarkable accuracy. They maintained complex calendars and eclipse predictions. It is conceivable that they also tracked human physiological thresholds in relation to ritual timing. If certain quantities of blood loss consistently produced visionary states, that knowledge would be refined through observation. There is no surviving manual detailing how much blood was considered optimal. There are no written disclaimers about the risks involved. Yet the repetition across centuries demonstrates confidence in outcome. The ritual persisted because it worked in the sense that it reliably induced the intended state. If the Mayan elite used controlled bloodletting to explore the boundaries of consciousness, then these ceremonies functioned as early experiments in neurophysiology. Pain, deprivation, and expectation combined to unlock perception shifts interpreted as divine communication. Where does spirituality end and biological manipulation begin? And when altered states are engineered through measured harm, is the resulting vision revelation or the predictable consequence of a body pushed beyond equilibrium? The Aztec poison trials. In 1487, during the height of the Aztec Empire, tribute flowed steadily into Tenochtitlan from conquered regions across Mesoamerica. Alongside gold, cacao, and textiles came plants. Roots, bark, seeds, and resins from distant climates were cataloged by imperial herbalists. Codices later transcribed by Spanish chroniclers describe a vast pharmacological knowledge base maintained by Aztec physicians known as Ticatl. Among these records are references to substances capable of numbing limbs, inducing sleep, halting the heart, or clouding the mind. These were not random discoveries. They were categorized effects. Effects imply testing. The Florentine Codex, compiled in the 16th century from indigenous sources, lists plants such as tilapatl and mixitl, with notes on their impact when ingested or applied to wounds. Some entries describe dosage differences. Small amounts caused tingling or dizziness. Larger amounts resulted in paralysis. Excess led to death. The language is observational rather than mythic. It distinguishes between partial and total incapacitation. That distinction suggests calibration. Archaeological remains from temple complexes and sacrificial sites show ceremonial blades coated with organic residues now identified as plant-based toxins. In certain burial contexts, skeletal remains display no trauma, yet show chemical markers consistent with poisoning. While ritual sacrifice often involved overt methods, the presence of toxins indicates an alternative mechanism. A body that appears uninjured but collapses silently is a different kind of demonstration. Spanish accounts, though colored by colonial narrative, describe condemned prisoners being given substances prior to execution to weaken resistance. Some observers noted that captives became lethargic or disoriented before ceremonial events. Whether intended for ritual control or medicinal experimentation, the repeated exposure of human subjects to varying plant compounds created data. Aztec markets in Tlatelolco were described as containing stalls dedicated solely to medicinal plants. Merchants sold standardized bundles, implying known potency ranges. Healers prescribed treatments based on symptom patterns. That level of sophistication required trial and error across generations. While some experimentation likely occurred on animals, human application would have been unavoidable, particularly in a society that normalized public execution. Toxicology relies on thresholds. Below a certain amount, a substance alters sensation. Above it, organ systems fail. Ancient Aztec knowledge appears to reflect awareness of these boundaries. Controlled incapacitation would have been valuable in warfare and governance. A poison that immobilizes without killing could neutralize resistance. One that kills swiftly could eliminate threats without spectacle. Following the Spanish conquest, much indigenous medical knowledge was suppressed or reinterpreted through European frameworks. Many codices were destroyed. Surviving texts were filtered through missionary transcription. Direct records of experimentation did not survive intact. What remains are fragments pointing toward a systematic engagement with botanical chemistry. If Aztec healers and priests deliberately tested plant compounds to determine precise physiological outcomes, then they engaged in an early form of pharmacological research. The boundary between medicine and weapon blurred. The same leaf that eased pain could induce fatal arrhythmia in greater quantity. How many subjects were required to define those limits? And when knowledge of life and death is derived from calibrated toxicity, does the line between healer and executioner dissolve entirely? The Sushruta surgery trials? In 600 BCE, in the northern regions of the Indian subcontinent, punishments for certain crimes often involved the removal of the nose. The act was both physical mutilation and social exile. Yet within this severe legal framework emerged something unexpected. Medical texts later compiled into the Sushruta Samhita describe detailed procedures for reconstructing the nose using skin grafts taken from the forehead or cheek. These were not theoretical musings. They were step-by-step instructions. Measurements were specified. Incision angles were described. Healing timelines were recorded. Reconstruction required repetition. The Sushruta Samhita, attributed to the physician Sushruta, contains over 100 surgical instruments, illustrated and categorized by function. It describes the use of sharp blades for cutting, forceps for holding tissue, and tubular devices to maintain nostril openings during healing. One section outlines how to measure the missing portion of the nose using a leaf template before cutting a corresponding flap of skin. The graft was then rotated downward and stitched into place with fine threads. This level of anatomical awareness suggests direct observation of vascular supply and tissue viability. Archaeological evidence from ancient medical training sites in Varanasi indicates that students practiced incisions on gourds and animal tissue before operating on humans. This structured preparation implies standardized teaching rather than isolated ingenuity. Reconstructive attempts likely occurred repeatedly, especially in societies where nasal amputation was common. Some grafts would have failed due to infection or insufficient blood flow. Others would have survived, providing empirical confirmation of technique. Descriptions within the Samhita include warnings about swelling, discoloration, and necrosis if incisions were placed too deeply. The text advises maintaining cleanliness using herbal antiseptics derived from neem and turmeric. Such guidance reflects accumulated outcomes. Success rates improved through comparison of results. The body became a testing ground for surgical refinement. Centuries later, British surgeons stationed in India during the 18th century encountered local practitioners performing similar nasal reconstructions. Reports published in European medical journals in 1794 describe astonishment at the sophistication of these procedures. Western surgeons subsequently adopted and adapted the technique, crediting Indian methods as foundational to modern plastic surgery. Yet the early experimental stages that made refinement possible remain obscured. There are no detailed accounts of how many patients underwent unsuccessful grafting. No records quantify complications or mortality. However, reconstructive surgery in its infancy could not have been perfected without trial. Skin graft survival depends on precise vascular alignment. Ancient surgeons would have learned through direct observation which flap thickness endured and which failed. Each patient provided data. Unlike gladiatorial trauma or ritual bloodletting, these procedures aimed at restoration rather than destruction. Yet the process of discovery involved risk. Pain management was limited to herbal sedatives and fermented drinks. Infection control relied on plant-based remedies without understanding of microbes. Operating under such conditions meant accepting uncertainty. If early Indian surgeons systematically experimented with tissue transfer to restore identity and function, then reconstructive medicine did not arise spontaneously in modern hospitals. It evolved from repeated intervention in a society where disfigurement was common. Surgical innovation emerged from necessity, but necessity required human subjects. How many early patients endured experimental grafts before the technique stabilized? And when healing depends on calculated risk, at what point does compassionate treatment become controlled biological trial? The Carthage Tophet records. In 1921, French archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Carthage uncovered a burial ground unlike any other in the Mediterranean. Beneath layers of ash and broken pottery lay thousands of small urns. Each contained the cremated remains of infants and young children. Stone stelae stood above them, carved with inscriptions and symbols dedicated to deities such as Baal Hammon and Tanit. The site came to be known as the Tophet. At first glance, it appeared to confirm ancient accusations that Carthage practiced child sacrifice. But as excavation continued, a deeper question emerged. The burials followed patterns too precise to ignore. Osteological analysis conducted over decades revealed clustering and age distribution. Many of the remains belonged to children under 2 years old, with a noticeable concentration around specific developmental stages. The cremation temperatures were consistent across large groups of urns, indicating controlled burning rather than chaotic disposal. The stelae often recorded dates and family names. This was not an occasional rite, it was systematic. Ancient Greek and Roman writers described Carthaginian rituals in sensational terms, claiming that infants were offered to appease the gods during times of crisis. Modern scholars debate the reliability of these accounts, arguing that enemy propaganda may have exaggerated events. However, the archaeological record does not erase the scale. Estimates suggest that over several centuries, tens of thousands of urns were placed within the Tophet precinct. What makes the site unsettling is the apparent regularity. Burials increased during periods of famine and military threat. Some researchers have proposed that the Tophet functioned partly as a cemetery for infants who died naturally, their cremation ritualized as dedication. Others argue that the uniformity of bone fragments and burn patterns implies intentional selection. The truth may lie between interpretation and evidence. If selection occurred, it implies criteria. Criteria imply observation. Anthropological studies of the urn content show that some children exhibited signs of prior illness or malnutrition. Others appeared healthy before death. This variability complicates simplistic explanations. Were these offerings chosen randomly, or were certain conditions deemed acceptable for ritual dedication? The repetition across generations suggests that the process was institutionalized. Carthage was a sophisticated maritime power with advanced trade networks and administrative systems. Its governance relied on organized record-keeping. It is conceivable that the Tophet was not merely a site of sacrifice, but a space where demographic realities were absorbed into religious structure. High infant mortality was a fact of the ancient world. Incorporating death into ritual could have served both spiritual and social functions. Yet the precision of the urn arrangement, the consistency of cremation, and the scale of the burial ground indicate method. Whether sacrificial or funerary, the Tophet represents a repeated response to early death. It transformed mortality into structured offering. In doing so, it created one of the most controversial archaeological sites in history. Modern excavations continue under tight regulation. Interpretations remain contested. Some nations avoid definitive language. Others embrace the darker reading. What remains undeniable is the presence of pattern, thousands of small urns, ordered rows, names etched in stone. If Carthage normalized ritualized death at such scale, was it purely devotion, or did it reflect an attempt to manage demographic crisis through spiritual logic? When mortality becomes ritualized and repeated across centuries, does it reveal belief alone, or something measured beneath it? The Sokushinbutsu Experiment. In 1783, in a remote temple in the mountains of northern Japan, a Buddhist monk entered a small underground chamber, barely large enough to sit upright. A bamboo tube allowed air to pass through the soil above him. Before sealing himself inside, he had already spent years preparing. His diet had been reduced to nuts, seeds, and tree bark. Later, he consumed lacquer tree sap, known to induce vomiting and poison parasites within the body. By the time he rang the final bell signaling he was still alive, his body fat had nearly vanished. Days later, the bell stopped. The chamber was sealed. Years afterward, it was reopened. If the body had not decomposed, he was declared Sokushinbutsu, a self-mummified living Buddha. The practice of Sokushinbutsu was not common. It was rare, deliberate, and extraordinarily controlled. Surviving records indicate that the process unfolded over approximately 1,000 days of dietary restriction, followed by another 1,000 days of near-complete isolation. The first phase eliminated fat, the primary substrate for bacterial decay. The second phase introduced toxic sap that further reduced internal microbial life. By the time the monk entered the chamber, his body was dehydrated and chemically altered. Modern forensic examinations of preserved Sokushinbutsu bodies reveal remarkable tissue stability. Skin clings tightly to bone. Internal organs are desiccated rather than liquefied. There is minimal evidence of insect damage. The preservation is not accidental. It reflects deliberate metabolic manipulation. The monks did not simply starve. They engineered internal conditions hostile to decomposition. Japanese temple archives record only a few dozen successful cases across centuries. This low success rate suggests many attempts failed. Bodies that decomposed were buried quietly and not venerated. Those that endured were elevated as proof of spiritual achievement. Hidden within this spiritual narrative is a biological experiment repeated across generations. Each monk followed similar preparation stages. Variations in climate, soil composition, and dietary detail likely influenced outcomes. The chambers were typically buried 6 to 10 feet underground, where temperature fluctuation was limited. Moisture control was critical. Some sites were located in regions with dry mountain air, reducing humidity and filtration. The environment was part of the design. It was not only the body that was modified, the burial context was engineered. During the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, the Japanese government outlawed the practice, labeling it archaic and dangerous. Official support ended. Surviving Sokushinbutsu bodies were preserved as cultural relics rather than living embodiments of faith. Access to certain temple archives remains restricted. The detailed records of unsuccessful attempts are sparse or absent. If Sokushinbutsu represents a form of self-directed metabolic preservation, then these monks achieved what ancient Egyptian embalmers sought from the outside. They transformed their internal chemistry before death. The body became the experiment. The outcome was binary: preservation or decay. Modern science studies caloric restriction, autophagy, and microbial ecology to understand longevity. Yet centuries earlier, in isolated mountain temples, individuals attempted to alter those very systems through discipline and controlled toxicity. They lacked microscopes. They possessed observation. How many bodies failed before patterns emerged? And when the human organism is deliberately pushed to the threshold between life and preservation, is the result enlightenment, or the final data point in a silent experiment spanning generations? Conclusion: across ancient civilizations, the pursuit of knowledge did not emerge in isolation from risk. It unfolded through calculated intervention, repeated observation, and controlled exposure to the limits of the human body. The experiments explored in this investigation reveal a pattern that transcends geography and belief. From the embalming chambers of Egypt to the chemical trials of Mithridates VI, humanity repeatedly transformed fear, faith, and survival into structured experimentation. Egyptian embalmers refined preservation through methodical iteration, manipulating salts, resins, and environmental conditions to halt decay. In imperial China, alchemists pursued immortality through mercury compounds, documenting physiological reactions that foreshadowed toxicology. Greek physicians advanced anatomical understanding through dissection, converting mortality into medical knowledge. Mithridates of Pontus transformed poison into protection, establishing one of the earliest documented traditions of chemical immunity. Roman gladiatorial arenas functioned as living laboratories of trauma, while Mayan bloodletting rituals explored the thresholds of altered consciousness. Aztec healers calibrated botanical toxins with precision, and ancient Indian surgeons perfected reconstructive techniques through repeated intervention. In Carthage, patterns of ritualized mortality left behind statistical echoes, and in Japan, monks practicing Sokushinbutsu attempted to control metabolic decay from within their own bodies. Different cultures, different motives, yet the same methodology persists: trial, observation, refinement. What history preserves are the perfected outcomes: intact mummies, effective antidotes, surgical breakthroughs, and preserved bodies. What remains largely unrecorded are the failures, the poisoned subjects, the unsuccessful grafts, the decomposed remains, and the countless lives lost in the pursuit of understanding. Knowledge advanced quietly, often shielded within priesthoods, royal courts, and monastic orders. Its origins were rarely celebrated, and its costs were seldom acknowledged. These ancient experiments challenged the perception that science began with modern laboratories. Instead, they revealed that early civilizations systematically engaged with anatomy, chemistry, physiology, and pharmacology long before such disciplines were formally defined. Progress emerged not from certainty, but from uncertainty tested repeatedly against the human body itself. The question that lingers is not whether these experiments occurred. The evidence suggests they did. The deeper question is whether the foundations of modern science were built upon methods we would now consider ethically unacceptable. When discovery requires crossing the boundaries of life, belief, and survival, progress and transgression become inseparable. If history remembers only the successes, then the true cost of knowledge remains buried alongside those who did not survive the trial.